Yeah, I'm sure we can have a sensible discussion about intelligence on the internet. Welcome to Dangerous Policy, a channel aimed at intelligent people wanting to consider complex ideas affecting life and society. My name is Crispin, and today I'm going to talk about intelligence itself, IQ. And what prompted this is a tweet from Andrew Yang. For those who don't know, Andrew Yang is an American, or was an American, Democratic presidential candidate. He's a futurist, technologist, very much in the Silicon Valley sort of cabal, but a very broad-minded, reasonable individual, very popular across party lines, was quite popular even with Trump supporters, and is an extremely articulate individual. So I'll read you his tweet. And I didn't realize this. His tweet's actually quite old, but it has resurfaced on the grind. People have been retweeting it a lot recently. And I quote, "As someone who was very good at standardized tests growing up, I think they are a terrible measurement of anything other than whether you're good at the test. Certainly have nothing to do with human worth, character, or virtue." So that latter part is unquestionably true. An IQ test will not tell you your character in any way. In fact, the correlation between empathy and intelligence is zero. There's no relationship known whatsoever. And in fact, when they there was an experiment where they tried to teach very high IQ sort of psychopaths moral reasoning. Now, they pick that up very, very quickly because they can have high cognitive comprehension skills, but that didn't make them more ethical people. And in fact, the reverse was true. It allowed them to more easily manipulate others and exploit them because of their understanding of the various perspectives and the attitudes that different actors would bring to each scenario. So there is no relationship between intelligence and character. But the first part of his paragraph is absolutely, completely wrong. And what makes people a little bit cynical about this tweet is that he would know better. Andrew Yang is a very intelligent, switched-on person, clued in with the latest research in this sort of area. And he would know that it's simply not true. That IQ indeed is in fact a completely immutable characteristic. IQ tests are excellent at judging cognitive ability, general intelligence, and that you can account for it across cultural lines. Like there's no structural bias to any significant degree in IQ tests. You can account for those differences between sort of language and culture and background. And so what we have is a distribution where, as a lot of people know, the 50th percentile is 100, and then a massive distribution towards outward across standard deviations towards the extremes. Now, intelligence makes people very uncomfortable, and what Andrew's sort of comment is very much about what people prefer to be true rather than what the facts show. That is that people would like to believe that you can teach anyone to do anything, that you give them enough training, enough work that they can actually develop those comprehension skills necessary to achieve any task. And unfortunately, that simply isn't true. And it has significant, in fact, increasingly profound consequences for our society. And that is because our society is becoming much more complex, and the distribution of capital within that society is being skewed far more to people of high cognitive ability. So there are certain facts about intelligence I wanted to just sort of lay on the table. People can attack it and challenge it, but the facts remain. There they are. The first is that intelligence is real. Secondly, that it is largely inherited and immutable. That is, like height, like body type, you simply, like your biological sex, you simply have no control over that inheritance. It is something that you're born with, very difficult to change. You can do things to retain it, quality exercise, good diet, lots of mental stimulation, you can retain your IQ for longer and sort of stave off a mental deterioration. But you cannot adjust. You cannot really make someone of modest intelligence someone to become a genius. That is not within the capacity of our current technology. So what we have is a distribution, and people are very uncomfortable discussing it. And there are a couple of reasons for that. The first reason is when you start talking about intelligence within and between groups of people, right? And that is a very fraught exercise. And the only group that I'm actually interested in that respect is the Jewish people, because the Ashkenazi Jews skew very strongly towards high intelligence. In fact, they're on average a full standard deviation above the mean, which at the middle doesn't really explain much. But at the extreme high-end intelligence, that has a walloping effect, and I'll come to what that means in other areas. But in the case of say the Nobel Prizes, even though they make up a tiny portion of 1% of the world population, Ashkenazi Jews make up 25% of all Nobel Prize winners. So they're making an enormous contribution to life and society, but it is something quite special about them. And so we need to, I think we need to understand that and see if we can replicate that success somehow across other different groups. So that is a fraught thing, because if you start talking about a hierarchy of intelligence across different racial groups, then you're in a very dangerous area of thought, right? And we've been down that road before, which is one of the reasons why Jews themselves are very reluctant to explore this space, is because they have enormous grace as a rule, and they realize more than most where these sorts of things can lead. But as my own view is that it's a fact, and facts need to be contended with, and the complex consequences of facts is something that is the aim of this discussion, right? Like, how do we as a society manage complicated data, right? The data that's only going to get more complicated as technology progresses. How do we take something that may be a factual statement but not apply a nefarious, unethical value to that fact? Because it's only our judgment about things that actually causes harm, not the actual data itself. And to compare that, you can sort of think about other areas of distribution. So, for example, there are groups of people who are much taller than other groups of people. Like that's a factual statement. No one is contesting that. There are groups of people that are much better at long distance running than others, much better at sprinting than others. These are all different groups, genetically kind of predisposed to certain characteristics, achievements, and deficits. And yet we don't have the same attitude, same cultural value ascribed to that as perhaps we do in the space of intelligence. And I think there's a couple of reasons for that. One is that what separates humans from other animal species in our own thinking is often intelligence. Like we go, well, there are plenty of animals that run faster, jump higher, much stronger than Homo sapiens. However, our cognitive function, our ability to reason and plan, our ability to visualize a future state that is separate to our current state, and the various adjustments between then and now, i.e. imagination. These things are unique, or thought to be unique to the human race. And so because we say that is our distinctiveness, I think that lends itself to people's intuition that intelligence somehow ascribes value. But it is nevertheless an incorrect predilection, right? So we have to be aware and call that intuition out. I don't think it makes people a bad person to think that way, but it is an erroneous logic, right? Because what actually has the greatest value to human society is that which contributes the most to that society. And those traits are not intelligence. Those traits are empathy, caring for one another, nurturing, forgiveness, peacefulness, agreeableness, and in some cases disagreeableness, calling out things that are harmful, standing up to illegitimate and tyrannical authority. Like there's a give and take there, and so we need to understand that distinction, that someone can be of modest cognitive ability and yet still contribute enormously to the broader community. And then there is also an irreducible value to human life that is something ephemeral, hard to put your hand on, but every person is of equal human worth. And so just by virtue of being a human being, there is an inalienable value that makes you equal to every other person. So that kind of value system needs to be applied when analysing data of this kind. What my interest is, and why I think we need to discuss it, is that intelligence has profound impact on our society. And I think it's incumbent upon us to discuss this openly and sensibly because of the harmful effects that it is having in our world. So, for example, as I said before, the distribution of capital is being skewed far more tightly towards people of high intelligence. And this is where Andrew Yang's comment is, people are cynical about it, because Andrew Yang is a strong proponent of UBI, Universal Basic Income, to account for the massive dislocation of people who were previously sort of workers in factories and things like that being replaced by automation. Now, Andrew knows perfectly well that it's the scalable industries that now dominate capital, right? So if you are a highly intelligent person able to write an important bit of code that is replicated across the world instantly and incrementally improves productivity, then you will dominate capital, right? Like that's the current global system, one of big data and one of high production. Whereas if you go back, in the centuries past, where the vast majority of people were working in agrarian agriculture, yes, you could be intelligent in the way that you managed your crops and the way you did your farming techniques. And unlike Mr. Bloomberg, I think that farming and farmers do very highly technical work to manage their rotations and crops. But nevertheless, people of average intelligence could become very, very good producers of agricultural products in a way that no matter how much training you give someone, they are not necessarily going to be able to develop highly complex AI systems or apply quantum mechanics to modern technology, right? They're poles apart in that respect. So previously, intelligence was really good for separating us from the animal kingdom, but within the human race wasn't so significant, right? Whereas nowadays, intelligence is by far and away the greatest predictor of long-term life success at an individual level. So of course there are external factors, who your parents are and where you're born and where you're educated, all that stuff. But at the personal level, your IQ is directly proportional, no matter where you are on the distribution, to your long-term life success. And that in that scale is becoming sharper, right? It's turning into an exponential curve. So if you're someone of high intelligence, your proportion of the total commonwealth, the total wealth of the society, that part of the pie is increasing, which means that intelligence is leading to social inequity, economic disparity. And what I think we're risking is the very thing we're seeking to avoid, which is we create a class of people of high intelligence who control all of the capital. And of course, that group of people are going to think themselves to be superior to everybody else. People like to reason that they get where they've gotten to by their own hard work and gifted abilities, and they'll see it as natural that the intelligent should rule over everything, and that is the dystopia that we need to avoid, right? Where we do then start to devalue the other characteristics of people that make them critical to be included. So, that's kind of my framing of this. So I think that I like Andrew Yang a lot. I think that he's a very reasonable person. He deals with complex ideas really, really well. But that particular comment we view as cynical because he's directly pandering to a group of people rather than contending with the facts and the consequences of those facts that tie into his own philosophy about UBI and why that's an important policy innovation. So where do I think on this? Well, just I guess to explain a little bit about the relationship between intelligence and competence, right? And I'm going to use poker as a great example because I like poker and I think it will resonate. So I think you can teach any person of average intelligence to be a winning poker player, right? With enough work, enough training, enough explanation, enough coaching, at the kind of the grassroots level of low stakes poker at the casino, you can turn a person of 100 IQ into a consistent winning player. I'm confident, certain of that, right? But at some point, intelligence becomes the determining factor between poker players. Think of it as a hierarchy: ultra high stakes players, all the way cascading down to the losing regs, right? At some point, everyone's putting in the same amount of work. Everybody is, using solvers and training techniques and working hard at studying and so on. They're putting in the same amount of effort away at the table. They're reviewing their own hands for various leagues. And then at that point, the difference between the world-class winning player and the good player is IQ. And you can say this for any domain of competition, really. Not everyone can work as hard as Roger Federer at being a tennis player, but not everyone is going to be as good at Roger Federer, even if they did all the same things, all the same amount of work with the same level of coaching and access. They would not be able to match his raw, prodigious ability at the game, right? So not everyone can be Beethoven, no matter how much musical training they get, no matter how much they work at it. And in fact, in Beethoven's case, he overcame an extraordinary deficit towards the end there in going completely deaf. I mean, Beethoven's Ninth Symphony is not something that will probably ever be, necessarily replicated. So there is something about this. This is not something we're just making up. And there are, I guess the other concern that people have as a consequence of that is discouraging people. So using intelligence and IQ too much to determine job applications and things like that. And I'm actually critical of this as well. I'm not sure that we should be using IQ tests in job applications. What I think we should be doing is, for complex positions, having tests that are relevant to that role. And then if someone of lower IQ works harder, is more passionate about it, and makes up for the effort through study and training and does better on that test than someone of higher IQ, well, that's great. They should win that. So I am actually, I am against pulling IQ tests away from job entries because I think that is not an appropriate mechanism for determining one's competency for the job. I think it should be tailored specifically to that job. But the other areas where I think IQ tests are appropriate is how they were originally designed. They were originally designed to identify people of talent who should be put on a track towards university and high competency professions, but weren't necessarily born to the right families and didn't have the wealth behind them, so they wouldn't have otherwise been identified. And to that end, I am resolutely resentful and vengeful towards Harvard University for what is a completely racist policy that they have. And there's no other way to describe it. They mark down Asian students, right? Because Asians have consistently performed better than most other Americans in the entry exams. So what they've done is they've marked Asian students down based on race. They claim it's personality, which strange that it all happens to be Asian people, and to allow their legacy, the legacy students to enter. And we see that, if you do it straight on effort and admission exams, then Asians completely dominate in the United States. Like, so University of California, Berkeley, another kind of Ivy League, that they're largely Asian students because they've worked harder and they have, on average, a greater IQ. So this, entry and access for education should be based on one's ability and commitment to work. Like that's absolute. But in the process of looking at that, we also need to step back and say, okay, well, what is something we actually value most in our society? And we understand that we're creating a world in which IQ is much more relevant for economic productivity than it has ever been in the past. Is that fair? I don't think it is. I think that if you are getting overwhelming life success for a characteristic of which you do not personally control, then it's incumbent upon you to make the society better for everybody else, other people who are doing things that may not be economically productive, but is nevertheless essential for society. So carers, child caring, like nursing and things for others, like all of this stuff that requires human interaction and dealing with people, but isn't necessarily a scalable industry. We need to redistribute that capital to support and encourage the people that are working in those areas, because we would be a much worse off society without them. So that's my view. And in that sense, I think UBI, Universal Basic Income, is something to help address that. Now, UBI is a topic of a policy, something that we will talk about in another time. But that's the rationale for it. If you've got all the global wealth going to people of extremely high IQ, and look, it's not for nothing that Elon Musk is worth over $40 billion US, right? These are highly intelligent people that they didn't do anything to earn that. They definitely work enormously hard, and Elon has a prodigious work ethic and a highly creative mind, right? And I really like the guy personally, but but he didn't do anything to earn his IQ, right? And so he and others like him, and I'm sure Elon would agree with this, need to do more to ensure that the equitable distribution of capital in a world in which we prejudice towards people of high intelligence. And there are other areas where people have enormous life success for things that they don't control, right? So one of the other great predictors of life success is just your physical height, right? Being taller means that you earn more, right? It's just one of those things. And that's not something that people seek to correct. Like, we don't go around, chopping off shins trying to get people to all be the same height. And same with physical attractiveness, right? People who are highly physically attractive have much, much better outcomes than people who are unattractive for obvious reasons. They have a profound impact on those around them. So, but we don't seek to correct for that either, right? So it's not, we have these inherited inequities, right? And we wouldn't seek to correct the inequities internally, right? We don't seek to correct immutable characteristics. We don't try and make people unattractive. We don't try and make people the same height. We won't try and make people of the same intelligence. What we will try and do is look at the impact that is having on the world and how we extend opportunity and inclusion to as many people as possible. So I hope that kind of lays out the way I think about it. We do need to discuss intelligence, so we can't just hide behind the data for fear of the ideological consequences. Just because some people may use it to support, racist ideas and their a very ugly worldview, it's incumbent upon sensible people who are trying to do good, to contextualize the data in such a way that minimizes the likelihood of that happening. And as I say, if we don't do that, If we just sit on our hands about this, then the disparity is going to become so stark that that on both sides, the people of high intelligence will think that they're born to rule, and everybody else will think there's a conspiracy. So we need to deal with the consequences of that and avoid that outcome at all costs.